Our program today is on conservation initiatives in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and it's a very appropriate time to have this session. November 12th, last month, the leaders of the 9 countries negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership announced achievement of a broad outlines of an agreement. And then I think very recently, Ambassador Marantis, our keynote speaker, was in Japan consulting more on the TPP negotiations. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, let me just make a quick note about the Woodrow Wilson Center for those of you who have never been to a program here before. The Wilson Center was established in 1968 by an act of Congress to be a national memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who was the only president who was both a scholar and a policy practitioner. The center is strictly nonpartisan, and our objective is to promote dialogue from all perspectives on critical issues facing our country today. And many of you may know our relatively recent new president and director, Jane Harmon. Before I introduce the keynote speaker, let me just ask people if you have a cell phone on or any electronic device that might interfere with the program, if you could please turn it off. Well, Ambassador Marantis has been Deputy U.S. Trade Representative since 2009. He's responsible for trade negotiations with Asia and with Africa and all global initiatives on trade and development, labor, and environment. From 2005 to 2009, he was Chief International Trade Counsel for Senate Finance Committee, and before that, he served as Issues Director for the Kerry Edwards presidential campaign in 2004. And prior to that, he was in Hanoi as Chief Legal Advisor for U.S.-Vietnam Trade Council, and prior to that, he was at USTR, Assistant Attorney General for Associate General Counsel for negotiating the Singapore and Chile agreements and handling some disputes at the WTO. He has a a legal degree from Harvard Law School and an AB in Public and International Affairs from Princeton University. So, Ambassador Marantis.
Thanks. Thanks, Bill, and thanks everybody for coming out today. There's a lot of really exciting stuff going on in the area of trade and the environment, and Mark Linscott and I have been talking for a while about wanting to be able to talk more about all of the great work that we're doing, and it's nice to have this opportunity to do so. So thanks everyone for being here. You all know that just over 10 years ago, the WTO's ministerial meeting in Seattle became the real flashpoint for a boiling over of public concern about trade's impact on the world's people and on the planet. Aside from the shattered glass and the tear gas, among the more memorable snapshots from Seattle was the more peaceful marching of dozens of environmental activists in a menagerie of animal costumes. They were calling for greener trade policies and expressed deep concern that trade rules were thwarting efforts to protect wildlife species and fragile ecosystems around the globe. Today, although marchers still take up to the streets over trade, we have come a long way since Seattle and since the shrimp turtle wars ignited at the intersection of trade and environmental policies. But frequently I'm still asked, does the Obama administration take environmental concerns into account with respect to trade policy, and if so, how? I'm also asked whether or not current efforts to double U.S. exports are any more compatible with the protection of the environment and conservation of natural resources. The simple answer to this question is yes, and more so every day. For many years, there's been a static perception that trade agreements threaten the environment, period. But in truth, there has been tremendous progress in integrating environmental considerations into U.S. trade policies. And in this regard, the Obama administration is carrying forward that banner boldly. Today, we are on the brink of a new turning point on trade and the environment. For the President, trade agreements are part of the solution to pressing international and environmental challenges. And in a world more interconnected than ever before, we see trade's potential to drive both higher standards of environmental protection and cooperative efforts to conserve living resources. President Obama understands the seriousness of the message broadcast through bullhorns and placards back in Seattle and still advanced by environmental thought leaders today here in Washington and around the world. And so he insists that we must pursue our trade negotiations and the economic growth opportunities that they offer with keen sensitivity to environmental implications. For him, we must develop and implement a better understanding of how trade agreements can advance environmental protection. That is why we are building on past progress and are assimilating environmental priorities more directly and aggressively into our trade policies. We are translating our greater understanding of trade and environment and the nexus between the two into a set of policy goals and are incorporating these goals into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, negotiations. Let me set the stage briefly for TPP before going into more depth about what we're doing there in the area of trade and the environment. This administration considers TPP to be the ideal forum for advancing innovative concepts generally in the trading context. With TPP, we aim to create a platform for regional economic integration in the Asia-Pacific, boosting U.S. economic growth and supporting high-quality jobs here at home. We will do this by increasing U.S. exports to a region that includes some of the world's most dynamic and robust economies. As you all know, the Asia-Pacific represents more than 40% of global trade and is home to 41% of the world's population. We are starting with an initial group of like-minded countries in the TPP: Australia, Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam, and hope to eventually expand this group of countries across the Asia-Pacific. Last month, at the APEC leaders meeting in Honolulu, the TPP leaders announced that we have reached the broad outlines of a high-standard 21st century agreement, and they made the conclusion of TPP a priority. They also welcomed the interest of several other countries in joining the TPP, making these negotiations the biggest game in town in just over a year and a half of negotiation. We have high aspirations for TPP. We're seeking ambitious commitments on cross-cutting issues included for the first time ever in any trade agreement, such as regulatory coherence, supply chains and competitiveness, and small and medium-sized enterprises. We're also seeking concrete steps to topple behind-the-border measures, and we have tabled new, innovative approaches on current challenges, such as the behavior of state-owned enterprises in international trade and indigenous innovation measures that disadvantage U.S. technology. Environmental challenges are not new in trade, but dynamic new solutions are possible on this old point of contention. We have asked ourselves and others, how might TPP incorporate priorities on the environment that have never before been included in trade agreements? We have solicited input from many of you in the room, as well as from members of Congress. And our mutual goal is to develop strong commitments that reflect our priorities on both trade and the environment. Luckily, we're building on an increasingly strong foundation. Our recent FTA with Peru and the Korea, Colombia, and Panama agreements that Congress just passed already include strong environmental provisions. Among them are obligations to effectively enforce environmental laws, not to derogate from those laws to increase trade or investment, and to put in place laws and regulations to implement certain multilateral environmental agreements such as CITES. Importantly, each of these obligations is subject to the same dispute settlement provisions that are applicable to other chapters of these trade agreements, such as the intellectual property provisions. Our aspirations for TPP also spring from the vital and successful work we've done over this past year in APEC. As part of the U.S. host year for APEC, President Obama insisted on ambitious results for lowering tariff and non-tariff barriers on environmental goods and services in the region, and we got one. Last month in Honolulu at the APEC leaders meeting, all 21 APEC economies made a commitment to reduce applied tariffs on environmental goods to 5% or less by 2015. The 21 APEC economies also agreed to eliminate non-tariff measures such as local content requirements. In the TPP, we're seeking to go even further. We believe all 9 countries and eventual partners can agree to eliminate all tariffs on environmental goods. Similarly, we are building on the agreement of APEC leaders last month to take actions to prohibit trade in illegally harvested forest products. But perhaps the most groundbreaking element of our proposal for TPP is the inclusion of a conservation framework in the TPP Environment chapter. This framework would require TPP parties to act to inhibit illegal trade in wildlife and wild plant products. That wonky-sounding phrase obscures activities that responsibly we should all work together to stop, whether it involves forest products manufactured from illegally harvested tropical timber, or body parts from threatened tiger species, or fins brutally torn from sharks at sea. More can be done to fight illegal trafficking in wildlife and wild plant products and to better protect these resources in the region. The TPP countries, as you all know, already represent some of the richest and most biologically diverse areas in the Asia-Pacific. But the diversity in these countries and in others in the regions is currently at risk. Peru is the 3rd most biodiverse country in the world, but 560 of its species are threatened, 45 of which are critically endangered. Many of New Zealand's species are unique to that country and are also under threat, such as the kakapo, a large flightless nocturnal parrot. Chile is home to 151 threatened species, including the chinchilla and Darwin's fox. In October, only days after the last round of TPP negotiations in Lima, the WWF and the International Rhino Federation announced that the Javan rhinoceros is now extinct in Vietnam. This was the last surviving animal in the same group of species as the extinct woolly mammoth. For conservation groups worldwide, this announcement was met with sadness and frustration, as many efforts had been made in the past to protect this species from illegal poaching. Clearly, it's time to look for even more solutions for threatened species, and rhinos offers a particular example. Reports indicate that rhinos are struggling to survive in nearly all of their native habitats, and that there are near daily reports that rhinos in Africa are also being illegally poached, with their horns traded in the Asia-Pacific region to meet a market demand for perceived medicinal benefits. The impact on wildlife and our fragile ecosystems from illegal environmental trade is clear and tragic, but unfortunately it pays those who engage in it. Across the globe, international trade in wildlife and wild plant species that have been illegally poached or harvested is valued at tens of billions of dollars. The same global criminal networks that deal in illegal narcotics and arms trade are active in trafficking illegal wildlife products to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year. The value of trade associated with illegal logging has been estimated to be as high as $6 billion a year alone. In marine fisheries, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, so-called IUU fishing, ranges from $10 billion to $23.5 billion a year. This, along with capacity-enhancing subsidies amounting to approximately 25% of the value of global total catch, have contributed to the decimation of fishery stocks. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization determined last year that 80% of global marine fishery stocks are in dire straits. Taking steps to stop this lucrative criminal activity so damaging to this planet is an imperative. Many of our TPP partners are already hard at work to better protect wildlife and wild plant species that are heavily traded. We have worked closely with New Zealand, Australia, Peru, and Chile to seek strong disciplines in the WTO on fishery subsidies. Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam are all members of the ASEAN Wildlife Enforcement Network, through which they share information on illegal trafficking on wildlife species and cooperate in enforcement activities. We believe that the TPP can and should strengthen these efforts. TPP has the potential to change the course of an international engagement to address these challenges. As we build a more economically integrated Asia-Pacific community of nations, we can also construct a new community to conserve our wildlife, marine and forest resources, and prevent illegal trade in these products. The United States' proposal in the TPP environment negotiations seeks to directly confront the types of illegal activities and marine subsidy practices that have been shown time and again to be harmful to resource conservation and sustainable economic development and growth. For the conservation framework in the TPP, we have proposed strong disciplines to ensure that each TPP country has measures in place to deter illegal trade into and out of its territory, whether or not the product originated in another TPP country. We have combined this with cooperative approaches to enhance information sharing and law enforcement assistance among TPP countries. We have also proposed mechanisms to increase engagement between governments and stakeholders who often have critical expertise in identifying risks to endangered species. Beyond this framework, we have put forward more specific disciplines and cooperative approaches in 3 distinct areas: wildlife species of special concern, marine fisheries, and forest ecosystems and trade and timber species. In particular, these include a series of strong obligations on marine fishery subsidies and measures to deter IUU fishing. New Zealand has also recently made a proposal on marine fisheries, and we are working together with them to integrate their ideas into our proposals. I am exceedingly proud of the green paper that USTR is releasing today. It's so good that we couldn't call it a white paper. It provides more details on the proposals that I just outlined for a TPP conservation framework, and it will show how the United States is ready to go farther than ever before in comprehensively confronting the problem of illegal trade in wildlife and wild plant products. And we believe that we have the right partners in the TPP negotiation to move this issue forward. I began my remarks by referencing the concerns of many, past and present, as to whether trade and environment policies can ever be compatible. In fact, I am convinced that the TPP is a truly unique opportunity, perhaps the best that we've ever had in international trade negotiations, to finally show that trade and environmental policies can be and are in fact compatible, and that the world is better off both economically and environmentally when they are. Increased trade and the economic growth it can bring can become a starting point, not a sticking point, for innovative environmental policy. I look forward to our negotiations on these proposals. Of course, they're not going to be easy, but no negotiation ever is. But with our partners in the TPP, the United States will work to steer this trade agreement that will result in fundamental reversals in activities that threaten wildlife conservation, contribute to deforestation, and degrade our global commons. Because we believe that working together, trading partners can protect our precious environmental resources for the health of our people today and for the benefit of future generations. So there's a lot of good stuff going on in the TPP negotiations, and I'm very proud of what we're pushing for and what we've been doing. And the green paper that we've circulated here today and that we will actually release publicly today, gives more details on the outline that I provided in my prepared remarks. But this is really an exciting time to be involved in trade generally and specifically in trade and the environment. We're working with some amazing trading partners who share our views, who share the same challenges that we see in the area of environmental conservation. And though, again, the negotiations are not going to be easy, we are confident that we'll be able to achieve an outcome that both promotes economic growth and protects the environment. So thanks, everybody, for being here, and I appreciate your patience.
I know you have to leave, but I do have one quick question for you before you do. But I'd just like to make a quick comment. I just a personal feeling that I think that the U.S. has done a good job on trying to promote synergy between trade and the environment. Given the protesters at Seattle, I think that far and away the most progress has been made on the environment, much more than labor and economic development. In addition to the things that you mentioned on environment, I mean, we now do environmental assessments of the impact of trade agreements on the U.S. number of the agreements promote synergy between between the agreement and the various multilateral environmental agreements, and also there's been a fair amount of capacity building in the environmental area. So I think that's all very commendable. But I wonder, since you've just come back from Japan, if you could comment on the likelihood of Japan and other countries joining, and what the implications of that would be if they did.
Sure. Before I do that, I wanted to just make one other point that I forgot to make in my remarks, and that the work that we've done on this proposal and on trade and the environment generally has been, obviously, led by the very able Mark Linscott, who all of you know, and Kelly Milton, who's in the room here somewhere, in the back. And we have them to thank for the tremendous advances that we've made. And so I just wanted to just recognize them and applaud them for all of their really hard work. I also want to point out, too, that nothing that we do at USTR in terms of our trade negotiations we can do by ourselves, because we're such a small staff and we rely so much on the input of stakeholder groups on all issues that we work on. And so for those of you from the various NGOs who have been active in helping us craft a really solid proposal on TPP, thank you very much. Additionally, none of our work gets done, and we can do without the close cooperation of our colleagues in Congress. Trade policy is all about the congressional executive partnership, and trade policy only functions when we, the administration and Congress, are operating in harmony. And Alex Perkins is here from the Democratic staff of the House Ways and Means Committee. Many of you know Alex, who has been really at the vanguard of pushing us hard on trade and environment issues, whether it was in the context of the annex, the forestry annex in the Peru agreement, or in helping to develop the conservation proposal that we're so proud of here. So Alex, thank you, and to folks on the Hill for all of the hard work that you guys have done and the support you've given us. So to answer your question, in Honolulu, there were 3 countries who expressed interest in joining the TPP, or not so much joining the TPP, but expressed interest in beginning consultations, with a view to possible TPP membership: Japan, Canada, and Mexico. And as Bill said, I went to Tokyo just after Honolulu, and it was more to sort of explain what the process is in terms of countries that are interested in joining the TPP. And what I told our Japanese counterparts, and what we've also told our Canadian and Mexican counterparts, that we are about to begin a very robust consultation process. A Federal Register notice, in fact, should be out this week on the 3 countries and on the issues that each raises with respect to TPP. So we will be consulting very closely with stakeholder groups. We'll be consulting very closely with Congress as we sort of work to determine what the various issues are with respect to whether it's Japan, Canada, or Mexico's interest in joining the TPP. In parallel, we will have conversations with our counterparts in these governments, so that they have the benefit of our consultations with our stakeholders, and also a clear sense of what the expectations are for joining the TPP. It's a very, as I said earlier in my remarks, and as you know, it is the most high standard trade agreement that we've ever negotiated, and it's up to the aspiring countries to decide whether or not it's in their interest to join the TPP, and whether the high standard commitments that we're negotiating, whether it's in environment or in other areas, are commitments that government can actually take on. So over the course of the next months, we will be in active consultation with stakeholder groups, members of Congress, as well as with our partners in these applicant countries, so that they have a very clear sense of what our expectations are. But ultimately, the decision to join or to become part of TPP is not a unilateral decision that we, the United States, will make, or one of the aspiring countries will make. It's something that's done on the consensus of all 9 TPP countries. So I would expect that in the same way that we're going through our own domestic process of consultation here, our partners in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Chile, and Peru will also be engaged in their own consultation process with their stakeholders, and will be involved in their own discussions with Japan, Canada, and Mexico, so that we can collectively determine how to move forward. It's also important, though, to underscore that as these conversations with Japan, Canada, and Mexico will continue, we are still moving forward aggressively on a parallel track with the 9 countries to get the TPP done. Our leaders in Honolulu gave us the very express guidance to make as much progress as we can over the course of the year. I was joking earlier with somebody that the success that we've been able to achieve in the past year and a half, and the tremendous enthusiasm that the TPP leaders had in Honolulu, means that we've got a lot more work to do, going forward, because the enthusiasm and the progress has generated the expectation that we're going to make, more progress and keep the momentum for the TPP negotiations going forward over the course of 2012. So, obviously more to come, and there's a lot of great stuff going on. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Marantis. What we're going to do now is I'll introduce our 3 panelists, and each of them will talk for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of opportunity for you all to ask a lot of questions, and I'm sure that there are a lot of them out there. So let me just start by introducing the first panelist, Eric Bilski, who is Assistant General Counsel and Senior Litigator at Oceana. He's worked with Oceana since it was founded in 2001, and prior to joining Oceana, he was an attorney with the Ocean Law Project at Earth Justice and a legal practice professor at the University of Michigan Law School. He has a BA magna cum laude with distinction in philosophy from Yale College, a master's degree in philosophy from UCLA, and a law degree magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. The second panelist is going to be Lisa Handy, who is a senior policy advisor at the Environmental Investigation Agency, where she focuses on forest conservation, climate change, and illegal logging issues. Prior to joining EIA in 2009, she was Senior Director for Government Affairs at Conservation International. She also worked for 7 years in a number of capacities at the Department of Commerce, including Senior Policy Advisor for Trade Development and Energy, and also worked on commercial cooperation with Russia. She has a master's degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and an undergraduate degree from Brown University. The third panelist is Mark Linscott, who is Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Environment and Natural Resources. He's responsible for all trade and environment issues, including the FTA negotiations, the World Trade Organization, the OECD, and the multilateral environmental agreements. From 1996 to 2002, he was with the U.S. mission in Geneva, where he worked on trade and services, customs issues, anti-dumping, government procurement, and technical barriers to trade, among other things. He started working at Commerce Department in 1985, and where he was awarded Commerce's highest medal, the Gold Medal Award, for the work that he did there. He has a BA in economics from University of Virginia and a law degree from Georgetown University. So why don't you go ahead? We'll start with Eric, and then Lisa, and then Mark. Use the podium or stay at your table, whichever you like.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. I will use the podium because if I can make it work, I have a PowerPoint presentation. Bear with me. So far, so good. I'd also like to thank Ambassador Marantis for his excellent presentation. So let me start out with who Oceana is. We're an international conservation organization, and we're dedicated to marine issues. We are just celebrating our 10th anniversary. We have offices in the Americas and in Europe, and our work affects most regions of the world. One of our highest priorities is promoting sustainable fisheries. And we found over the years that a number of the major problems facing global fisheries are fundamentally trade issues. Sustainable fisheries may be the first tangible example of an issue that truly is both a trade and an environment issue. So why are global fisheries relevant to trade agreements? Fish products are highly traded. World exports of fish and fish products have reached about $86 billion a year. That's about 37% of the industry's total production. That level of trade is equivalent to world trade in meat, or in trucks, or in cosmetics. Fishing is particularly important for developing countries. About 80% of world fishery production occurs in developing countries. On average, each fisheries job holder provides for 3 dependents or family members. So the fisheries sector and supporting sectors provide the livelihood for more than 500 million people, about 8% of the world's population. So this is a very important sector of the economy, but it's under unsustainable pressure from subsidies, from ineffective management systems, and from illegal fishing. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 85% of global fish populations are either fully exploited, overexploited, depleted, or recovering from depletion. In other words, there's not much room or any room at all to expand production, and existing production is in trouble. According to the FAO, the maximum long-term potential of world marine capture fisheries has been reached. So why are fisheries relevant to the TPP negotiations? Well, the Pacific Ocean accounts for about 55% of marine capture, about 45 million tons of fish. The combined coastlines of the TPP countries equal over 78,000 kilometers, which would be about twice around the globe at the equator. 5 of the 9 TPP countries are among the top 20 countries in the world for capture fisheries. We talked about additional countries entering consultations to join the agreement. The existing countries' fishery industries account for about 20% of total world wild capture. If Japan were added in, Japan by itself is the 6th largest producer of wild marine fish, and it catches approximately 5% of the world total all by itself. So the ocean, fishing, fisheries is central to these countries. And it's especially central to the livelihood of the poorer coastal communities in these countries. Ensuring the health of this very important industry, this very important economic sector, and this very important part of the environment is an essential component of these countries' development and economic growth strategies. So we need to counter threats to the sustainability of these fisheries. Now, as in all trade agreements, an important objective is also to promote a level playing field and to reduce trade distortions. And that's what we should aim to do with respect for fisheries in the TPP. Up until now, oceans and fisheries issues have largely been neglected in trade agreements. But with the TPP, we're changing that. And I'd like to talk about 2 of the major fisheries trade issues that we're addressing: subsidies and illegal fishing. Subsidies have been addressed in other trade sectors, in manufacturing and agriculture, in previous trade agreements, but fisheries subsidies are the missing piece. Likewise, with illegal production, existing trade agreements cover illegally traded goods like conflict diamonds or having anti-counterfeiting provisions, but illegally captured fish should also be covered. So let me talk a little bit about each of those issues. Subsidies always create unfair advantages for the subsidizing countries. In fishing, governments administer subsidies for things like boats, fuel that allows fleets to fish longer, harder, and farther away than is economically possible or is biologically sustainable. With illegal fishing, as Ambassador Marantis said, the scope is huge. The value of the world catch is between 80 to 100 billion. Sorry, let me keep with subsidies. The value of the world catch is between 80 and 100 billion dollars annually. Subsidies are a sizable chunk of that, about $20 billion. That's 20 to 25%. That's an even greater intensity of subsidies than in agriculture. Now I'll switch to illegal trade in fishing. And there also, the extent is huge. It's estimated that illegal fishing amounts to between $10 to $23 billion annually. And these practices create disadvantages for those who fish legally. Illegal practices come in a variety of forms: fishing in someone else's waters, using illegal fishing gear, violating internationally agreed catch limits, or selling falsely identified fish products. Illegal fish could be more than 40% of the catch in some fisheries, so it's a big problem. Well, unlike in areas such as agriculture or manufacturing, in which my subsidizing production doesn't diminish your production, in fishing, my illegal fishing, my subsidizing, hurts the environment, it hurts the resource, so it actually diminishes and depletes other people's fisheries. So in that sense, fishery subsidies may be more destructive than other kinds of traditional subsidies dealt with in trade agreements. The TPP has a unique opportunity to shape trade rules for the fishery sector, and the question for the TPP countries is, how can they get the most commercial benefits for their fishing industries in the context of this depleting resource? We have a blank slate internationally. The WTO has not solved this issue yet. So there's a couple of things to think about. Don't think of this as a trade and environment issue. This is a trade issue and it's an environment issue. There's not a separation, as Ambassador Marantis was indicating. Also, previous agreements are not necessarily the best models. The TPP should adopt tangible, clearly defined trade-related measures and measures that can be enforced through a binding dispute settlement mechanism. Why should it be done here? Why shouldn't we leave it to other negotiations? Well, even if work is occurring in other places like the WTO, the TPP countries have an opportunity to create a high standard and to go ahead and address certain problems that are of particular concern to them as specific economies and economies which have a huge presence in the fisheries sector. If the outcome of this kind of issue is left to other countries that don't have the interests and concerns of the Pacific countries, that outcome might not suit their needs and interests. We're talking about the TPP as a 21st century trade agreement, and solving problems of expanding trade while maintaining sustainability is exactly what a 21st century trade agreement should do. Finding solutions here in a negotiation among 9 or maybe a few more countries will be easier than in larger negotiations, but the group is diverse enough and has enough interests and enough range of interests that it won't just purely be a bilateral bargain. Dealing with these issues in concrete, effective ways will help make the TPP an authentically 21st century agreement. Thanks.
Why don't we get questions after all 3 panelists, if that works? And so why don't we go ahead and turn to Lisa, if you'd like to give your view from EIA.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm just going to stay put here if that's all right, because I don't have a PowerPoint for all of you. I would like to thank you very much for inviting me here to this important discussion today. The nexus of trade and environmental concerns has long been at the core of my organization's work. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the Environmental Investigation Agency, we are an advocacy group that works to document environmental crime and campaign for solutions at both the national and international levels. We've investigated international trade in environmentally sensitive products for more than 25 years and conducted detailed analysis on illegal timber, wildlife, and ozone-depleting substances. Our work has focused on the particular impacts of free trade agreements as well as the impact of the U.S. Lacey Act. And we are encouraged by the paradigm shift that has been outlined here today and that has been happening over the past 10 years or so that has placed illegal logging more fully in an area to be addressed as the trade issue that it is. The shift is changing the legal and financial incentives, and that's causing supply chain managers to pay attention to the impact of their choices on the forest. So while our organization cares very much about all the conservation issues that Ambassador Marantis pointed to today, I'm going to focus my remarks particularly in the illegal logging and associated trade area. Just quickly, illegal logging has a devastating impact in many areas, probably most obviously on the environment through deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and increased greenhouse gas emissions, but also on local livelihoods due to loss of vital forest resources and potential income streams, on economic development of countries as huge sums of money go to timber barons and corrupt officials rather than towards development needs and goals of timber-producing countries, and on trade as legitimate companies involved in the timber trade lose billions of dollars in revenue annually due to the market distortions caused by illegally harvested timber. It is estimated that illegal logging on public lands alone causes annual revenue and asset losses to governments in the range of $10 to $15 billion. In fact, staggering profits can result from the illegal export of valuable hardwoods or softwoods. Just to give you one example, indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon have been swindled into selling mahogany trees for as low as $5.30 per cubic meter. If you then look at the value of this same timber being traded on international markets, it's sold for as high as $1,700. Multiply that out across the country and across what's happening, you can see the losses to the government and to the local people. The government of Peru does not receive stumpage fees or appropriate taxes from practices like this, and Peru's long-term accessible and commercially viable forests resources are dwindling at an alarming rate. In contrast, if these trees were to be logged sustainably or legally, the lost revenue could be funding schools, hospitals, clean drinking water, these types of things, instead of being diverted to the bank accounts of illegal timber barons, corrupt enforcement personnel, and politicians. This is just one example. As I said, we have seen this in the course of our work mapped out across the globe. So at its foundation, illegal logging is a criminal problem and a demand-driven one, perpetuated by the multi-billion-dollar, largely no questions asked, global market for wood products. This is not a problem that can be effectively addressed in the forests alone, as the most serious illegal logging is committed for exports, not local consumption. This is where the Trans-Pacific Partnership can provide an essential component to address such illegal trade. Since opening up legal trade concurrently increases opportunities for illegal logging and associated trade, the TPP should be crafted to address this market distortion and also to promote the trade of legal and sustainable timber. In our view, the TPP represents an important and natural opportunity to effectively do this. All TPP countries are affected in some way by illegal logging and associated trade, so it should be an issue of concern to all negotiating parties. The TPP affords the chance to address illegal logging in a systemic manner within an important regional context. And finally, the TPP includes key producer, processing, and consuming countries, many of which have already begun to take important actions to limit trade in illegally logged wood and wood products. These initiatives represent a patchwork of important but disconnected actions. And just as the TPP is aiming to sew together and cohere a series of bilateral agreements, there is a need for a more coherent and harmonized regimen to prevent illegal trade. A July 2010 Chatham House report on illegal logging and related trade concluded, in fact, that effective action to combat illegal logging was not possible without these coordinated efforts by producing, processing, and consuming countries. And it also noted the positive impact that consumer country policies, such as the U.S. Lacey Act and the EU FLEGT VPAs, were having on this trade, along with improved in-country enforcement efforts. Current efforts to address illegal logging through bilateral agreements, multilateral environmental agreements, voluntary procurement measures, and national policies are all very important tools. The TPP could build upon these efforts by tackling the problem of illegal logging at its core, through direct and regionally integrated actions to combat the international trade in illegal timber and timber products. These actions should include a prohibition on trade of illegally sourced product, that would help countries to reinforce and strengthen each other's laws. It should also include enhanced enforcement cooperation, information sharing, and capacity building. As more and more countries enact and implement prohibitions, the drop in demand should significantly reduce illegal operations. Over the last decade, the United States has demonstrated a steady intensification in its focus and approach to illegal logging and associated trade. From the President's initiative on illegal logging and MOUs with Indonesia and China, to the passage of the 2008 Lacey Act amendments, the Forest Annex of the Peru Trade Promotion Authority, and the most recent experts group that was developed under the auspices of APEC, along with, of course, these TPP provisions. We greatly appreciate U.S. efforts of late to focus on this issue, yet the problem does still persist, and it would greatly benefit from the type of coordinated regional approach that the TPP conservation provisions would provide. The Environmental Investigation Agency supports the U.S. approach and encourages the countries negotiating the TPP to adopt strong provisions to address the issues of illegal logging, wildlife trade, as well as illegal and unsustainable fishing practices. It is essential that such provisions be subject to binding dispute resolution, like all other provisions in the TPP, rather than a cooperative approach, which has not proven to be as effective. Taken together, the provisions discussed here today should support legitimate trade and establish a positive conservation path for the trade agreements of the 21st century, paving the way to substantially reduce these detrimental trade practices and the adverse environmental, social, and economic impacts associated with them. Thank you very much.
Mark?
Thank you, Bill. And I'd like to start by thanking Bill Christ for organizing this event today. Bill has followed trade and environment issues for a very long time, probably longer than nearly everyone in this room, and that's impressive, and we appreciate his commitment to promoting the development of this area of trade policy. I'd also like to thank the other panelists. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today, and Ambassador Marantis as well. Ambassador Marantis and I have been talking for some time about doing this kind of event and giving him the opportunity to publicize much more the kinds of work we are doing on trade and environment, and specifically the TPP context. We had hoped to do that sooner. It's been an effort. We really didn't want to have an event like this until after we had all of our TPP proposals out on the table. We had a very deliberate process associated with that. It was very slow at times, but here we are, and the timing couldn't be better because, again, as Ambassador Marantis noted, we had a very significant recent event in Honolulu with the APEC economies, and on the margins of that, a meeting of leaders of the TPP countries who have charged us to conclude this negotiation very quickly. There's a high degree of enthusiasm for moving the negotiations along as quickly as possible. The TPP is unprecedented in so many respects. There are 9 countries involved, as has been noted. We are very different in a variety of ways. We have very different histories. We have different cultures. We have diverse geographical locales. We have different experiences in terms of economic development. That said, though, we all share a common vision, and that's truly leading in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of increasing economic integration. And my job, as charged by, and the job of others in my office at USTR, Kelly Milton, who's been working with us, Jennifer Prescott's here, who was responsible for our great APEC result on environmental goods and services. We've been charged with ensuring that the TPP countries come together to identify shared interests in protecting the environment and conserving natural resources. The diversity among us extends to our experience in negotiating environment in trade contexts. We do have a shared experience over the last 10 years in the WTO as part of the Doha development agenda. We've been negotiating on environmental goods and services, on multilateral environmental agreements and WTO rules, and on fisheries subsidies. But as all of you know, we have not yet successfully concluded those negotiations. So it is a limited shared experience. In terms of FTAs, our experiences are very different among the 9 countries. Chile, for example, has an FTA with all of the other TPP countries. So it has, in fact, a lot of experiences itself in terms of incorporating environmental commitments into its free trade agreements. We have Vietnam, which really has no previous experience in integrating environmental issues into its trade agreements. We have Peru. With Peru, we have a bilateral U.S.-Peru agreement, the Trade Promotion Agreement, TPA. It has very high standards in terms of environment. It incorporates the so-called May 10th, 2007 bipartisan elements on environment, and it includes an annex on forest sector governance, which is really quite far-reaching. And then we have New Zealand. New Zealand, over time, has made strong efforts with its FTA partners to address environmental concerns, but frankly, it's had limited opportunities to press for strong results in its negotiations. And in fact, many of those are in the form of side agreements to New Zealand's free trade agreements. The U.S. experience has also been very diverse. Going back to the NAFTA, the Clinton administration negotiated a side agreement on environment. Subsequently, in FTA negotiations, environment provisions were incorporated into the 4 corners of the free trade agreement and ultimately into chapters in the free trade agreements. And then more recently, we have the bipartisan May 10th, 2007 elements, which were included in the Peru agreement, as well as our most recent FTAs, which were recently passed by the Congress, those with Korea, Colombia, and Panama. Our challenge is to reconcile all of these different experiences, and in doing so, to achieve an ambitious result on environment in the TPP. We also see this as an opportunity for us to accomplish this across 9 countries in the TPP, with more countries to come, and to set a very high standard in terms of environmental provisions will be truly groundbreaking. So briefly turning to the present, we now have on the table in the TPP negotiations a comprehensive set of proposals covering a range of areas. These proposals were put together on the basis of broad-based consultations. We've had many discussions with the Hill as we put together these proposals on both sets of the aisle. We have had throughout our efforts input from stakeholders, many of which are around the room, in fact, 2 of which are at the table here with me today. We also have superb expertise from agencies, other U.S. government agencies, from the Department of State to Fish and Wildlife Service, to AID, to Department of Justice, et cetera. It's really an impressive team, and the results in terms of U.S. proposals are true interagency results. They are interagency proposals in these negotiations. The areas that are covered by our proposals, I'll just highlight a few. We've made a proposal on public participation. We've emphasized that the TPP agreement should provide opportunities for the public, for stakeholders, to provide views on implementation of an environment result in the TPP, to be able to interact with the parties, to meet with the parties, in fact, on the margins of meetings of an Environmental Affairs Council, and to also be able to submit communications regarding a country's failure to effectively enforce its environmental laws, and to have a procedure associated with that. We have a proposal which includes the core commitments under the May 10th, 2007 package. These are very far-reaching proposals. For example, that each country should have commitments to implement its obligation under certain multilateral environmental agreements. We have a proposal on consultations, including dispute settlement, and as Ambassador Marantis noted, the same dispute settlement that will apply to other parts of the TPP. And then we have the U.S. conservation proposal, which Ambassador Marantis outlined, and which is described in more detail in our green paper. A number of the other countries have made parallel proposals, and in fact, in some areas, new proposals. For example, New Zealand and Peru have made proposals on climate change and trade. Australia has made a proposal on environmental goods and services and how we can comprehensively liberalize trade in environmental goods and services under the TPP. So we have a lot in front of us. In terms of where we stand now, there are big gaps. I'm happy to say we all like each other. We've been negotiating for 9 rounds now, so we know each other well. There's a great dynamic, I think, at all the negotiating tables, and a very good interpersonal dynamics. That can't paper over the fact that there are still significant gaps that we need to bridge in these negotiations. There have been a lot of questions about our proposal that includes the May 10th, 2007 elements. There's been a lot of questions about our conservation proposal. A lot of interest among the countries in terms of their current approach to addressing trade, for example, in endangered species, and their implementation of CITES, and how our proposal would build on those existing approaches they have. We've been working closely with New Zealand on marine fisheries issues. They have a proposal that's very parallel to ours on fishery subsidies and IUU fishing, and as Ambassador Marantis noted, we are seeing how we can integrate those two proposals. So, in fact, I will leave off here on marine fisheries. It's a great example of the critical opportunity presented by this negotiation to make a real difference, a truly concrete difference in a specific area, and here the area of marine fisheries. Eric had a great graphic in terms of what's happened in the last 40 years in terms of global fisheries. It's truly tragic, and we can, in many respects, lead the way in terms of trying to reverse that trend, and more generally, as Ambassador Marantis noted, reverse certain trends in terms of illegal trafficking in wildlife and wild plant products. So we look forward to questions. Be gentle.
Well, before general questions, I'd just like to ask if any of the panelists have any comments on any of the other presentations you want to make, or should we just get into general questions?
Just general.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead. We'll go ahead with you. We'll start with you.
Okay, thanks.
Could you give your name and organization? And yeah, we do have mics to pass around.
Thanks. My name is Matt Schul. I'm a reporter with Inside U.S. Trade. I have two questions for the panelists and especially Mr. Linscott. Two things that both Oceana and EIA mentioned was that they want they want the provisions related to fishery subsidies and illegal trade in wildlife to be subject to binding dispute settlement. Could you explain exactly whether that's the case and how that would work as far as, I don't know, making sure that every country has a Lacey Act type of law in place and how you would really subject that to dispute settlement. And the second question is related to what you call the core obligations or the core commitments, I guess, on the multilateral environmental agreements. Vietnam and Malaysia have much less comprehensive participation in those MEAs than did some of the other U.S. FTA partners where the May 10 provisions were implemented. Peru, South Korea, Colombia were members to almost all of them. And does that mean that if you only have, Vietnam subject has to enforce the three that it's signed up to, does that amount, in your view, to a less comprehensive obligation, or how would you characterize that? Thanks.
Thank you. Should I, to respond to those, I've been at a number of events with Matt present. He's always the first on the draw, so I'm not surprised that you're. Regarding your first question, yes, we envision dispute settlement applying across the environment provisions of the TPP. So the answer to that is yes. We have raised some questions in particular contexts, which do require, I think, further exploration. I mean, for example, with respect to IUU fishing and measures that are in place under regional fisheries management organizations, where those RFMOs have their processes. We have raised questions of the other countries in terms of how we might approach that in terms of dispute settlement. But generally, I think it's safe to say that our proposal envisions dispute settlement across all of the environment provisions of the TPP. On your second question, yes, it's true in terms of the 7 MEAs that the U.S. has proposed that there are some countries that have not ratified those agreements. And it is an important question to which we are giving careful consideration in terms of how that should be addressed specifically in the TPP. And it's one we haven't resolved at this point in time. I will note that some of those agreements have limited relevance for certain countries. I mean, one of those agreements is the International Whaling Convention, and Brunei is not a whaling nation, nor is Vietnam or Malaysia. A couple of others are more regional fisheries type conventions, CAMLR and the IATTC, again, where there's much more limited relevance in terms of certain of the TPP countries. We are envisioning, a common obligation in terms of implementing obligations that already exist under these agreements. But in terms of the mechanics of this, we are still exploring this further.
Just one thing to be clear. So Vietnam has to implement its obligations under the three that it signed up to, right? And not some sort of, in some way, try to implement all seven, even though it hasn't signed up to them, right?
Now, if you're familiar with, for example, the Peru agreement, it's essentially an identical provision to that.
Yes, this gentleman right there in the third row.
Captain Greetings from London, Assistant Manager. First to Mr. Isiki. What is Oceana as to the charter and charter member and the financial source? And similar question to Mr. Andy. In addition to above question, what is the investigation authority of this agency derived from? And also to the last one, who is what's name? Mr. Linscott. The TPP, I think is from you people talk about is environment and conservation in nature, right? And you talk about there are significant gap remain. What's among the significant gap? And you have timeline to resolve them. Thank you.
Let's start with you, Eric.
All
Go
right.
ahead.
If I understood the question, I'd like to thank the questioner for giving me another opportunity to plug Oceana. First of all, anybody who wants details about Oceana can go to our website, oceana.org. But let me just give you a few facts. As many of you may know, Oceana is United States tax-exempt charitable corporation under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. In return for being given the privilege of not having to pay taxes and for people being able to make charitable contributions to us tax-exempt, we have a considerable commitment to transparency. And so many of our essential documents, and I can't remember exactly which ones, but probably our recent public tax filings and our articles of incorporation and our annual reports and so forth are available on the web or through us if you ask. As I said, we are a corporation, a charity set up with the goal of marine conservation. And one of our foremost interests is conserving marine fisheries, both to protect the marine wildlife and to protect sustainable economic activity. In terms of our funding, again, I invite you all to go to the Oceana website and donate and become a part of that. We were set up originally by a consortium of 5 foundations, I believe, who are very concerned about the importance of marine conservation issues and the lack of any public charities addressing those issues at the time we were founded 10 years ago, addressing those issues as the sole and foremost aim of the organization, as opposed to other organizations, and there are many organizations like World Wildlife Fund who do address marine conservation but have many other priorities. The last time I checked, and my information may be out of date, but we were about 70% funded by foundations, not only from the United States, but from around the world, and about 30% of our funding is from individual donors, both large and small.
And Lisa?
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for that answer, Eric. I will gladly do an equal plug for the Environmental Investigation Agency, which is also structured in the same way in the United States as a nonprofit 501c3. We have another sister organization in the United Kingdom as well. And you can get more information about us at www.eia-global.org. All of our recent reports and things are up there. And I think that pretty much covers what your questions are. Our donors are a mix of foundations, government, and individual donors at all levels as well. And that.
One most important,
Yes.
where is your investigation authority?
Mostly from the name of our organization. I mean, we kind of self I guess gave ourselves that authority. We're not directed by any sort of outside folks or anything like that. It's based on where we see environmental crime occurring, trying to find out the most details that we can figure out on that to bring forward solutions, as we talked about at the national and international level.
One comment before Mark addresses the significant gaps in timelines. Back in 2000, a lot more of the non-governmental organizations had a trade and environment program than seem to today. I guess it's a good thing. I guess it's because I think there's been a much better job of reconciling trade and environment than was the case in 2000. That was right after we came off of some bad NAFTA and WTO dispute settlements that were then subsequently appealed to the and came out to a much better level. Anyway, Mark, why don't you talk about the gaps? And
Sure. In terms of gaps, and perhaps that wasn't the best term to use, because many of the proposals are only recently on the table, and so there's still much discussion about the contents of those proposals and what the implications might be, et cetera. And I noted in my comments that we have very diverse experiences in terms of addressing environment in our trade agreements, and so we're discussing those differences in terms of how they are reflected in the proposals that are on the table. I think it's safe to say that there are a number of countries that have not included provisions in their trade agreements that go as far as those included in the Peru, Korea, Colombia, and Panama agreements. So there are a lot of questions associated with that. The conservation proposal is a very new approach. I mean, it's very trade specific, trade related, and we're talking about trafficking and these kinds of products crossing borders, illegally crossing borders. But it's all a bit new for all of us in that regard. You know, I do want to say there's earlier reference to a provision in our proposal that describing it as Lacey-like, and I don't know if that's the best way to describe it. We have proposed that countries have measures in place that would inhibit trade in products that were wildlife and wild plant products that were illegally harvested, illegally taken. I mean, there could be a variety of means to do that. I mean, for example, Australia has just developed legislation associated with forest products. So there's that experience. And we have our own Lacey experience, which is a century-old statute. It's very detailed, it's complex in certain ways. So it's a means to implement that kind of obligation. That doesn't mean that all aspects of Lacey would be relevant to that kind of proposal. So I just want to caution against the use of the term Lacey-like approach or provision.
okay. Next question, yes, sir.
Mark Hurley, I'm with the Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown. Hi, I'll repeat that. Mark Hurley with the Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown. I just wanted to ask people generally, putting aside the issue of subsidies in connection with the fisheries problem, almost all these issues are framed in terms of illegality. I mean, straight out illegality. And I'm wondering if either from the stakeholders' perspectives or from the USTR's perspective, whether this is viewed as an area where some form of international criminal sanctions are appropriate, and is that something that's being explored either within the TPP framework or in parallel to it?
I'll try to take a stab at that from the standpoint of illegal fishing. From the standpoint of somebody working on environmental policy, what you care about the most is stopping the impact of these illegal activities on the resource. From the standpoint of trade policy, what you care about the most is stopping the impact of these illegal activities on trade. So you ask yourself, what's going to be the most effective thing? And it seems, for the most part, that criminal penalties, because they are so severe, require elaborate procedures and stringent burdens of proof. Whereas if you're looking at what we as lawyers would call civil penalties, and you're looking at schemes like having blacklists of ships that can't enter ports, and things like requiring ships to notify countries before they enter a port, so-called port state measures, and things like requiring documentation of the catch to prove that it's legal, you can have a lot of effective techniques that, instead of putting the burden of proof on the governments, put the burden of proof on the industry to show that they're complying with regulations, and telling the industry, and if you can't show that you're complying with regulations, you can't trade these products. And I would not at all wish to suggest that we shouldn't continue criminal prosecutions, and there have been notable criminal prosecutions in the United States, for example, under the Lacey Act, of illegal fisheries trade, which have been very important. But we need to do more, and right now it seems like non-criminal measures like port state measures and catch documentation are the most promising path to pursue.
Yeah, just to add to that, from the timber side, I think from our perspective, it very much is, in addition to what's being done on the ground in a lot of these countries, is the measures that can be taken from the consumer angle and the market, just the market incentives that puts out there are really going to have the broadest impact. I think Lacey does have a criminal element to it that can be enforced. But as Eric said, I mean, these type of enforcement measures take a long time, and I think having those type of actions and enforcement examples out there are really important to the seriousness with which the countries take these issues. So I also wouldn't be opposed to there being more criminal sanctions on it, but I think the idea would be, in our view, that as more of these come online, that you could start getting at some of those elements through just changing the general practices, and to getting companies to push the questions down their supply chains, and hopefully having that effect.
Yes.
Thank you. Susan Finston Consulting. I was wondering if Mark Linscott and any others who would like could comment on the conservation aspects of the Environmental Goods Initiative in TPP.
Well, there certainly are environmental goods that through their use serve a conservation objective. And again, I earlier noted that Jennifer Prescott is in the audience, and she's our real expert in this area. So that, yes, that can be the case. I mean, it depends on, well, I mean, for example, renewable energy technologies are incorporated into the proposals we've made on environmental goods on a variety of fronts, and so we're talking about conservation of energy resources in that specific context. And we in fact have goods on our lists which have functions associated with wildlife conservation et cetera. In terms of the negotiation, we, again, there's a really quite a significant result in APEC a couple of weeks back, in which the APEC countries agreed to limit their applied tariffs on environmental goods to no more than 5% by 2015. And it included other important aspects too, in terms of eliminating local content requirements, et cetera. And a process will develop in the next year in terms of identifying relevant environmental goods in that context. In the TPP, we are, because it's a free trade agreement, and environmental goods and services are certainly priorities in that negotiation. We are anticipating obligations that would involve tariff elimination for those goods, and for services. The term is no non-conforming measures, so no non-conforming measures that are specific to environmental services. But to get back to your specific question, in fact, I would suggest you talk further to Jennifer in terms of the kinds of goods and services that serve that kind of conservation function.
Yes.
Michael Martin from Congressional Research Service. For clarification earlier, Mr. Linscott, you mentioned that New Zealand and Peru put in a proposal on climate change, but you didn't seem to indicate the United States had done so. Has the United States, and if not, or is the United States opposed to inclusion of provisions on climate change? And then a follow-up, you've sort of indicated just now tariff elimination on some categories as part of the anticipated sections on environmental goods. Are there other aspects, other proposals from other countries that would require U.S. legal changes or conforming legislation be approved by Congress? And then by extension to the other panelists, in your mind, are there things that the United States should do as part of the TPP package and change our domestic policies or our domestic laws to make the final TPP FTA one that recognizes the environmental issues in a manner that is consistent with free trade?
Mark, do you want to start on whether there's legislative changes needed, and then Lisa and Eric might comment on the other things that the U.S. might seek to do?
Yeah, and on the first question on climate change, we have not made a proposal, but we've been discussing the proposals that have been put forward by New Zealand and Peru, which are in fact very different from each other, so we are carefully considering the merits of those proposals, but we don't have one on the table at this point in time. In terms of domestic legislation, and well, certainly the TPP will require domestic legislation, and an aspect of that is to make changes in the tariff schedule. That's a key aspect of that would be relevant to environmental goods.
I guess I can make a couple of comments from the fisheries perspective. Some of the things that we're looking at in fisheries or related to wildlife, like the term Lacey Act type provisions that we're not supposed to say, but we do have a Lacey Act, so we do have that kind of illegal wildlife trade provision. Some of the things that we're looking at, like port state measures and catch documentation, we either through membership in regional fishery management organizations or through the current process of ratifying the port state measures treaty and passing implementing legislation are on a faster track right now. I shouldn't say they're on a faster track, but they're further along towards the finish line of the track than the TPP is. Other things like prohibition on overfishing subsidies, that's something that we don't do, but we don't have a formal prohibition in U.S. law on doing it in the future. So I would imagine that would be a new thing as part of the implementing legislation. So certainly things like that are in the cards in some way.
Yeah, so just a couple comments from me. I think legislatively the U.S. has really been the leaders right now on addressing illegal logging. And so there's nothing specific in that area, I would say, other than, nothing specific on the legislative side. I guess that there would just be like increased enforcement activities. Enforcement cooperation would be fantastic with many of the countries involved here. And to your question earlier, I think, Interpol and others are getting more engaged on this issue at the international level. So if folks can get more involved in that enforcement cooperation, outreach, and capacity building would be fantastic.
Could I just piggyback on Michael's question and ask the panel if you think that some of the provisions that we're doing in the TPP could be usefully extended to WTO or any other future or past U.S. FTAs, like if the free trade area of the Americas ever got underway again or what have you. So would these provisions be good templates for past agreements and future agreements, or are these sui generis?
I'll start off. I'll say absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that they would be great. I think, as I think Eric pointed out, or perhaps it was Ambassador Marantis, that it's a really important group of countries to start with for different areas of these negotiations, and it would be great if these could be built up to be broader in the Pacific and even to the WTO level, I think.
And I would just note that the most obvious example is fishery subsidies. In fact, in the TPP, we are building on many years of work in the WTO on fishery subsidies. Those Doha negotiations have encountered a number of challenges and obstacles and are not really moving forward right now. And so in the meantime, we have shifted to the TPP as really an ideal forum among a leading group of countries to negotiate disciplines on fishery subsidies that could then provide a model for other agreements and specifically the WTO at some point.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Long Yue Zhao. I'm a Chinese visitor from Nike University. I just like to follow your questions. Is raised practice questions because you have a very exciting TPP agreement. There is a highest standard, but if there is a trade between the TPP countries with the no TPP countries, what the requirement will be to satisfied? If you not satisfied with the high standard, that means no trade with them. Thank you. I'm not sure who can answer these questions. Thank you.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's not really how it works. There are, certainly in terms of tariff treatment, there's the ability to have differential treatment through an FTA that does not apply to other countries that are not part of an FTA, and that there are WTO rules in that regard. In terms of our conservation proposal, we have proposed that TPP countries have measures in place that would prohibit trade or otherwise provide tools that deter that trade in products, in wildlife and wild fish product, wildlife and wild plant products that were illegally harvested in another jurisdiction, in a TPP jurisdiction or in another jurisdiction. So, that would extend to the products. but it's not. I mean, I think that's the best direct answer I can provide to your question. It's not setting environmental standards for a non-TPP country and then saying, your products can't be traded from your country to TPP countries.
Okay, good, yeah. Jeffrey?
Jeff Schott with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Actually, in following up on that last answer, TPP participants have obligations under the WTO not to raise barriers, and so there is protection for third countries unless there is an exception under WTO rules for these issues. So that's an important consideration. But I wanted to ask Mark to follow up on some comments that Ambassador Marantis made earlier and then artfully left before he could be asked about them. I think he was perhaps intentionally ambiguous with regard to the candidate countries who announced their interest in joining the TPP talks. And the word joining the TPP is what he said. And the ambiguity is joining the TPP talks or signing and entering a TPP agreement, which envisages it's a two-stage process. And the question for Mark is, are you really going to demand some firm or expect some firm commitments from the candidate countries with regard to adherence to obligations before not using a veto of their participation in the negotiations? Or is this consultative process trying to figure out the overall package that would be expected and in the hopes that at the end of the day these countries will commit to a broad range of obligations, including those on conservation? This is, of course, very important for Japan, which is one of the prime targets of the efforts of Oceana and others to apply more disciplines on fish subsidies.
Jeff, at this point in time, I really feel like, it's unfortunate that Ambassador Marantis is not here to to respond to that question, because at this point in time, I really couldn't add to what he said. It really would be a bit beyond my immediate brief. So I'm sure that there will be much discussion in a variety of contexts on exactly how this will work in coming weeks and months, and so I think there will be a clearer picture over time. So.
Can I ask a quick follow-up of Eric and Lisa, and that is just what do you see as the implications of particularly the three countries that have been mentioned as possibly joining on? Are you strongly in favor of that? Do you see opportunities in there, or do you see perils?
Well, the three countries that were mentioned, I think, were Japan, Mexico, and Canada. They're all important fishing countries. Japan is, as I stated earlier, responsible for 6% of the wild capture and a very large percentage of the trade. And so it would be a very good thing to have these new agreements and obligations on subsidies and on illegal fishing and shark finning, and have these very important countries subject to them. I think there can be a misimpression of where Japan's interests are going to lie, because they are a very large fishing country, and maybe in general, because they're a large economy, they have some high level of subsidies. Japan has been very strong in international fora opposing subsidies that contribute to overfishing, which is the kind of subsidies we're focusing on here. And they've been very strong opposing illegal fishing. So we've got every reason to expect that they could be a very constructive presence. And Mexico and Canada can also be very constructive presences.
we have not yet fully assessed the implications of the three, and particularly Japan haven't understood the full implications for the ag and forestry sector in country. However, if I could speak specifically to the illegal timber and wildlife provisions being discussed, it would certainly be beneficial to have the broader countries engaged for the regional coherence of the policies and the enforcement action.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, let's take you.
Hi, Amy Chu with BNA. I wanted to ask, in terms of APEC in Honolulu, that gave U.S. and other TPP negotiators a timeline and a goal to achieve the significant conclusion that was achieved. Is there another such event on the horizon or in anticipation? I know you said leaders encouraged very quick negotiations, and I'm assuming that means among the 9 that are currently within the negotiation.
Well, we are moving ahead without delay in terms of the negotiations with future rounds. There's a team in Kuala Lumpur this week. There's plans for next session. So we are moving quickly along in terms of events. I mean, APEC has been. Is always the opportunity when trade ministers, all TPP trade ministers are present, and then at the end of the year, leaders are present. So APEC is the obvious time when there is a marking of where things stand in terms of TPP negotiations, and again in Honolulu that was a very important meeting. There was the release of the broad outlines of an agreement and a commitment to move these negotiations along towards conclusion during the course of 2012. So.
Yes, back there.
I just wanted to make an important clarification. The WTO does not bar domestic enforcement of environmental regulations or laws to protect species. The turtle exclusion devices were upheld also in the tuna dolphin case. The U.S. was allowed, and as long as it isn't arbitrary or for the purpose of discrimination, this is the kind of thing that's very useful to help define legal standards in the WTO. And just like the Information Technology Agreement started in APEC in 1997 during the Philippines host year and then was adopted by the WTO Singapore Ministerial, there's a good chance that some of these environmental norms could later on be adopted by WTO, and then they would be binding on all, 151 WTO members.
To be expanded in a couple of weeks. Any other questions? I have one question for Mark, and that is, have environmental impact assessments been done for any of the other countries besides the U.S., or will they be doing any?
That's actually a good question, and one that we will have to follow up on. We are conducting our own environmental review. We have the related executive order on environmental reviews, and we are proceeding through an interagency process with an environmental review of the TPP negotiations. There will be an interim review. I think that's likely to be in the early part of 2012. And associated with that, there's been an opportunity for public comment. We've done Federal Register notices, et cetera. I have to say, at this point in time, I don't know the answer to the question what other countries are doing. We have had experiences in the past in which an FTA partner did conduct an environmental review in parallel, although I think that's probably the exception more than the rule.
Okay, good. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I want to thank our panelists very much for coming today, and I think this is really an important topic. And again, I want to just congratulate all of you on the progress made. So thank you all for coming.